The wind at the Redemption Creek bus stop has teeth. It bites through thin calico and worn denim, a constant, whining reminder of how little stands between a soul and the vast, indifferent prairie. A woman, Elspeth, sits on the hard bench, her body folded into itself, trying to conserve a warmth that feels like a distant memory. Her face is a roadmap of hardship, etched with sun and sorrow, her hands chapped and raw. She is invisible, a piece of tumbleweed lodged against the station wall, waiting for the wind to take her somewhere else. A small pair of scuffed boots stops in front of her. Elspeth doesn't look up. Children are often cruelest, their honesty a sharp, unblunted knife. She braces for a jeer, a rock, a taunt about the smell of dust and despair that clings to her like a shroud. Instead, a voice, clear and serious as a judge's gavel, cuts through the wind. You need shelter, it's a statement of fact, not pity. Elspeth finally raises her head, her gaze meeting the steady, unnervingly adult eyes of a girl no older than 10. The child is wiry and plain, with a braid as tight as a hangman's knot and a jaw set with grim purpose. And I, the girl continues, her small chest puffing out with the gravity of her pronouncement, need a mom. Well, that's one way to make a deal. Before these two figure each other out, tell us, what's the most unexpected way you've met someone important? Share your story in the comments. And if you love a surprising connection, hit that like button. The girl's proposition hangs in the air, as stark and unbelievable as a snowfall in July. Elspeth, who had been an expert in the nuances of survival, how to sleep in a hayloft without being caught, how to make a heel of bread last 2 days, how to look past the scorn in a shopkeeper's eyes, had no answer for this. The stagecoach was late, as it always was, and the world had apparently decided to slip its moorings. The woman's mind, dulled by hunger and fatigue, struggled to form a response beyond a dry, rasping laugh that never came. A mother. She hadn't been a mother in 10 years. Not since the fever took her own little boy and then her husband, leaving her with a patch of land the bank wanted more than she could defend. The girl, seeing the woman's stunned silence, seemed to take it as an invitation to negotiate. I have a place, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It's not much, but it's dry, and I have a little money put by. Enough for beans and flour for a while. She hitched up a lumpy satchel that looked far too heavy for her. My name is Lily. Elspeth found her voice, a rusty thing and used to conversation. Where are your folks? Lily's gaze didn't waver. Don't have any. Not anymore. The finality in those words was a cold, hard stone, and Elspeth recognized its weight. It was the same weight she carried in her own heart. I came from the St. Jude's orphanage over in Dusty Flats, Lily explained, as if discussing a town she'd merely passed through. It wasn't a good place. The matron had hands like shovels and a soul like a dried-up well. This child spoke of hardship with a pragmatism that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. Elspeth saw the flinty resilience in her, the same kind of desperate grit that had kept her own feet moving long after her spirit had wanted to lie down and be reclaimed by the dirt. She looked from the girl's determined face to the faces of the few other people waiting. A rancher and his wife, who pointedly looked away. A young man in a dusty duster who spat tobacco juice near her feet. In their eyes, she was nothing. A problem. A piece of refuse. But this strange, solemn little girl looked at her and saw a solution. Why me? Elspeth asked, the question clawing its way out of her throat. Lily surveyed her critically. You look sad, she said, with the simple clarity of a child. But you don't look mean. The mean ones, they look right through you. You see me, and it was true. In that moment, Elspeth was seeing her more clearly than she'd seen anything in a long time. She saw a flicker of her own lost boy in the girl's stubborn chin, a shadow of her own younger self in the fierce will to simply endure. The offer was madness. A homeless woman and a runaway orphan, playing house on the edge of a town that tolerated neither. Every sensible part of Elspeth screamed to refuse, to tell the girl to find the sheriff, to get on the next coach back to wherever she came from. But sense was a luxury for people with full bellies and warm beds. All Elspeth had was the gnawing emptiness inside her and the biting wind on her back. All right, Lily, she heard herself say, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. Show me this place. The place was a derelict-lined shack a good mile out of town, half hidden in a shallow ravine choked with sagebrush. It had been abandoned for years, its single window boarded over, and its door hanging from one leather hinge. To anyone else, it was a ruin. To Lily, it was a fortress. She pushed the groaning door open with a proprietary shove, revealing an interior that was dark, dusty, and smelled of mice and decay. But in one corner, a small, neat pile of blankets was laid out on a bed of straw. A tin can held a few wildflowers, long since wilted. A small stack of books was piled carefully against a wall. Lily had been here for some time. She had tried to make it a home. Elspeth's heart, a tight, cold knot in her chest, loosened just a fraction. This wasn't a whim. This was a plan, born of desperation and a child's formidable will. The roof leaks some over there. Lily pointed a small, dirt-smudged finger. But this corner stays dry, and the old stovepipe is rusted through, so we have to be careful with a fire. But it's ours. Ours. The word struck Elspeth with the force of a physical blow. It had been a long time since her world had included anyone but herself. She ran a hand over the rough-hewn wooden table, the only piece of furniture in the room. It was sturdy, like the girl. Their first days were a careful dance of necessity and discovery. Lily, it turned out, was possessed of a squirrel's talent for acquisition. The money she'd mentioned was a small, precious hoard of coins she had saved and pilfered over a year at the orphanage, enough for a sack of flour, a slab of salt pork, and a bag of pinto beans. She knew which baker's wife would sometimes leave out day-old bread and which farm had a patch of wild onions growing by its creek. Elspeth, in turn, found parts of her old self stirring from a long slumber. The hands that had grown stiff and clumsy from disuse remembered how to patch a leaky roof with mud and grass. She knew how to make a savory stew from almost nothing, how to soak the beans to make them last longer, how to stitch a torn dress so the mend was nearly invisible. She taught Lily how to set a simple snare for rabbits, and Lily, with her quiet patience, was a natural. They spoke little, their communication built on the rhythm of shared tasks. Elspeth would watch Lily sitting by the firelight, her brow furrowed in concentration as she read from one of her worn books, and a fierce, unfamiliar protectiveness would well up inside her. Lily would watch Elspeth's competent hands knead dough for flatbread, and a feeling of security, something she'd only ever dreamed of, would settle in her small chest. But their fragile peace was contained within the four walls of the shack. The town of Redemption Creek was a different world, one of suspicious eyes and closed doors. When Elspeth ventured in for supplies, she dressed Lily in the cleanest clothes they had, pulling the girl's hair back into a neat braid. They walked with their heads held high, a silent pact between them to feign a belonging they did not feel. Lily called her Aunt Elspeth, the name feeling both strange and precious. It was Mrs. Gable, a woman whose piety was matched only by her inquisitiveness, who first tested their flimsy narrative. She ran the ladies' auxiliary at the church and considered the moral inventory of the town her personal responsibility. She saw them in the general store, her sharp eyes cataloging Elspeth's worn dress and Lily's too serious face. "New in town, are we?" Mrs. Gable asked, her voice sweet as molasses and just as sticky. "Just visiting family," Elspeth replied, her hand resting lightly on Lily's shoulder. The small bones beneath her palm felt as fragile as a bird's. "I see," Mrs. Gable said, her gaze lingering. "And what is your name, child?" "Lily," the girl answered, her voice steady. "I'm staying with my Aunt Elspeth." The lie was smooth, but Elspeth felt the woman's disbelief like a change in the air pressure before a storm. Mrs. Gable was a predator who had caught the scent of something out of place. They left the store with their meager supplies, the woman's scrutinizing gaze burning into their backs. That night, the silence in the shack was heavier than usual. The unspoken fear sat between them. "She didn't believe us," Lily said quietly, not looking up from the rabbit stew she was stirring. "We'll be more careful," Elspeth said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. How could they be more careful? Their very existence was a secret, an affront to the town's rigid order. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a name and a face. A few weeks later, Sheriff Brody stopped Elspeth on the street. He was a fair man, but a hard one, with a weary expression that suggested he'd seen every kind of trouble the frontier could produce. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, though his eyes were cool. "I've had a word from some folks. Concerns about the girl." Elspeth's blood ran cold. "She's my niece. My sister's girl. She's fine." "Is she?" Brody's eyes held hers. "She's enrolled in the schoolhouse, which is good. Teacher says she's bright as a new penny. But she's quiet. And you, ma'am? No one seems to know where you came from." He wasn't accusing, merely stating facts. This town values order. People without roots, they tend to cause trouble. "We're not trouble," Elspeth said, her voice tight. "See that you're not," he replied, and walked away. The warning was clear. They were being watched. The sanctuary of their little shack suddenly felt terribly exposed, its thin walls no match for the judgment of an entire town. That evening, the first autumn chill seeped into the shack. Elspeth found an old, threadbare quilt in her bindle, one of the last remnants of her former life. She draped it over Lily as the girl slept by the small, carefully banked fire. Lily stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at the quilt, then up at Elspeth. For the first time, Elspeth saw not just a determined survivor, but a vulnerable child, full of a longing so vast it made her own chest ache in sympathy. "Thank you," Lily whispered. "Get some sleep," Elspeth whispered back, her voice thick. She sat by the fire long after Lily was breathing evenly, the weight of her impossible promise settling upon her. She was this child's only defense against a world that would swallow her whole. The thought was terrifying, and for the first time in a decade, it made her feel truly alive. The transaction, shelter for a mom, was becoming something else entirely, something real. And the more real it became, the more terrifying the prospect of losing it was. The turning point came on a Tuesday. Elspeth had taken in some mending from the hotel, and Lily was walking back from the schoolhouse when she saw it. Nailed to the public notice board outside the sheriff's office was a handbill. It was a crude drawing of a girl with a tight braid, and beneath it, stark lettering offered a small reward for information leading to the return of Lillian Abbott, a ward of the St. Jude's Home for Unfortunate Girls. Lily's blood turned to ice water. She saw Mrs. Gable standing nearby, reading the notice with a look of smug vindication. Their eyes met across the dusty street. It was over. The lie had crumbled. Lily didn't run home. She walked, each step heavy and deliberate, a condemned prisoner on her way to the gallows. When she pushed open the door to the shack, Elspeth knew immediately. The girl's face was pale, her small shoulders slumped in defeat. She didn't have to say a word. "She knows," Lily whispered. "Mrs. Gable." She saw the poster. Elspeth closed her eyes, her heart pounding a frantic, trapped rhythm against her ribs. This was it. The end of their strange, fragile life. They would send Lily back to the orphanage with the shovel-handed matron. And her? She'd be run out of town as a vagrant and a kidnapper, if she was lucky. If she wasn't, she'd see the inside of a cell. The old despair, the familiar companion of her homeless years, rose up to choke her. It would be so easy to give in, to let the inevitable happen. But then she looked at Lily. She saw the terror in the child's eyes, the complete and utter collapse of the fierce hope that had sustained her. This wasn't just a runaway who'd been caught. This was a daughter about to be ripped away from her mother. The realization hit Elspeth with the force of a lightning strike. Somewhere along the way, in the quiet evenings and shared meals and mended dresses, the pretense had become the truth. This was her child. A different feeling surged through her, hot and powerful, burning away the despair. It was rage. Pure, protective rage. "No," Elspeth said, her voice low and hard. "They are not taking you." Lily looked up, a flicker of disbelief in her eyes. "But what can we do?" "We tell the truth," Elspeth said, her mind suddenly clear. "Not their truth. Ours." The confrontation took place the next morning. Sheriff Brody had sent word for them, his face grim. When they arrived at his office, Mrs. Gable was already there, perched on a chair like a vulture waiting for a meal to stop breathing. Beside her stood a tall, severe-looking man in a city suit, the agent from the orphanage. "Elspeth," the sheriff began, his voice heavy with regret. "This gentleman has come for the girl. There's a legal order." "Legal don't make it right," Elspeth stated, placing a steadying hand on Lily's shoulder. She met the agent's cold gaze without flinching. "The child is a runaway," the man said, his voice clipped and devoid of emotion. "She is property of the state until she comes of age. She will be returned to St. Jude's, where she will be disciplined and cared for." "You call what happens there care?" Elspeth shot back, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't know she possessed. "You call a place where a child would rather live in a dirt floor shack with a stranger care? I found this girl starving for more than just food. She was starving for a kind word, for a safe place to lay her head. I gave her that. Is that a crime?" Mrs. Gable sniffed loudly. "She's a vagrant, and she has taught the child to lie. They have been living in sin and squalor on the edge of my town." "Your town?" Elspeth turned her fiery gaze on the woman. "A town is more than a church and a general store, Mrs. Gable. It's people. And if your town can look at this child and see only a runaway to be returned to misery, then it's this town that's living in sin, not us." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. He had seen them. He had seen Elspeth's patient mending work, had seen the way Lily's grades improved at school, had noted the quiet dignity with which they carried themselves. He had seen the life they were building. "Let the girls speak," Brody said, his voice cutting through the tension. All eyes turned to Lily. She stood small but straight, her hand clutching Elspeth's. She looked not at the agent or Mrs. Gable, but directly at the sheriff. "I needed a mom," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "St. Jude's has matrons. They give you food and chores, but they don't have moms. They don't teach you how to make rabbit stew, or put a quilt on you when you're cold, or look at you like you're worth something." Her gaze shifted to Elspeth, and her voice softened. "She does. I chose her. Isn't that what a family is? Choosing each other." The simple, profound truth of her words silenced the room. The agent sputtered about regulations, and Mrs. Gable about propriety, but their arguments sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Sheriff Brody stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the dusty street for a long moment. He was the law in Redemption Creek. The law was about order, but he was also a man who had buried a wife and 2 children on the prairie. He knew that some things mattered more than rules on a piece of paper. He turned back, his decision made. "As far as I'm concerned," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a gavel strike, "this child is under the guardianship of her aunt, Elspeth. She is fed, she is clothed, she is attending school, and she is safe. To remove her would cause undue harm." He looked pointedly at the agent. "You can take that back to the state with my official seal on it. Now, I believe you have a stagecoach to catch." The agent, faced with the unmovable object of local authority, bristled but knew he was beaten. Mrs. Gable looked scandalized, but for once, she was speechless. They had lost. Elspeth and Lily walked out of the sheriff's office and into the bright, clean sunlight. They didn't speak. The dust of the street seemed less hostile, the wind less biting. They walked the mile back to their shack, their small victory settling around them like a warm blanket. When they reached the door, Elspeth stopped and knelt down, so she was eye level with Lily. She gently brushed a stray piece of hair from the girl's forehead. "You were brave," Elspeth said, her voice choked with emotion. "So were you," Lily replied, a small, watery smile on her face. In that moment, the last wall between them dissolved. Elspeth wrapped her arms around the girl, pulling her into an embrace that was fierce and tender and real. It wasn't a bargain anymore. It wasn't a deal struck at a desolate bus stop. This was a mother holding her child. Lily hugged her back, her small arms wrapping tightly around Elspeth's neck, burying her face in the worn fabric of her dress. She was home. They both were. Inside, the light from the single window fell across the rough table. Elspeth started a small fire in the stove to heat water for tea, her movements sure and familiar. She watched Lily take one of her beloved books from the stack and settle into her corner, the tension gone from her shoulders, replaced by a quiet contentment. The tiny, dilapidated shack no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It felt like the center of the entire world. Elspeth knew their life would still be hard, but they would face it together. She hadn't just found a roof over her head. She had found her reason. He watches her hum as she mends his shirt, and knows he'd bought more than a laborer. He'd found his heart. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.